What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Oklahoma Sooners are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Oklahoma did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Oklahoma. My projection for this team was a little bit high at 8-4. Of course, that projection was based off of what they did in 2023 in their last year in the Big 12. But then my prediction was a little bit low on them at 6-6, and that's exactly what Oklahoma did. So Oklahoma did what I expected them to do last year, going 6-6 overall in the regular season, but 6-7 overall if you count their bowl game loss at the end of the year. So kind of an up and down year for Oklahoma. You know, they weren't really as good as maybe a lot of people expected them to be, but they had a very tough schedule. I think that's the reason why they went 6-6. And again, they do play in the SEC now, which is really a tough conference to play in. So you look at this schedule last year. First off, in the non-conference, they played Temple, Houston out of the Big 12. Then they also had to play Tulane and then also Maine. So they didn't have a tough non-conference schedule, but once they got into SEC play, that's where things kind of really got tougher here for the Sooners. They played at home last year, Tennessee. They played them at home, South Carolina, and then also Alabama. So they only had 3 home games last year because they had that one neutral site against Texas. That's not basically a home game for either team, and it's also basically not an away game for either team, but it's out of their home place. So yeah, Texas, they played them in Dallas. They really weren't close to beating that team last year because Texas was a really talented team. And then you look at their true road games, though. They played Auburn, Ole Miss, Missouri, and LSU. So they played 4 away games in the SEC. They beat Auburn for their first official win as a SEC team, but they did lose to Ole Miss, Missouri, and LSU. But the biggest wins were definitely Auburn and Alabama. Those were probably the 2 biggest wins that Oklahoma had last year. But, you know, the Auburn game, that's definitely a big win because it was at Jordan-Hare. And then obviously the Alabama win, that was a big statement for Oklahoma heading into next year. So what does the schedule look like for 2025? Well, it's a tough schedule for 2025. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Oklahoma's non-conference opponents are this season. So you look at this non-conference schedule, they will play Illinois State, of course, Michigan out of the Big Ten. Then they got Temple, of course, on the road, which that is kind of weird to play Temple, a group of 5 team on the road for an SEC team. And then you got Kent State, so 3 cupcake games for Oklahoma, and then you got the non-conference matchup against Michigan out of the Big Ten. Yeah, that's going to be a big game there, but, you know, Oklahoma, you know, the offense for both of these teams last year weren't really the best, but it looks like Michigan might actually be heading back to where they used to be, and this is going to be a physical game. Just looking at both, you know, sides of the football, Michigan, as of right now, might have the better offense, but then defensively, it's kind of hard to pick who has a better defense because, again, both defensive teams are very physical, so again, that's really a big non-conference game. That's going to make the non-conference schedule a little bit tougher, but the good news for Oklahoma, it's at home here for the Sooners, so that's your non-conference schedule. Let's now take a look at their SEC games. We'll start with their home games in the SEC. They will play Auburn, Ole Miss, Missouri, and LSU, so the same opponents from last year, but they're just flipping the home and away. That's kind of how it is in the SEC. You're flipping the home and away, you know, from the teams that you play last year. But yeah, they beat Auburn last year on the road at Jordan-Hare. This time they played them at home. Then you got Ole Miss at home this year. They lost to that team like 26-12, I believe, or 26-14, so only by 11 points last year. They lost to 7 by Missouri last year. That'll be, of course, a revenge game. Same thing with the other, you know, 3 opponents, you know, Ole Miss, Missouri, and LSU. Those are all revenge games there for Oklahoma. They have a chance to beat them, but, you know, they might be slight underdogs in some of those games. So that's your home schedule. Let's now take a look at their road games in the SEC. Now, Texas is not an away game. It's on a neutral field. They play them in Dallas every year. So yeah, that's not counted as an away game in the SEC, but it's pretty much out of their home play. So we have to put it here on this away schedule. But yeah, they'll play Texas there in Dallas, and then you go on the road for your 3 true road games. They play on the road at South Carolina, at Tennessee, And then at Alabama, that is brutal there for Oklahoma. South Carolina, a pretty big surprise team last year, playing them on the road. That's a very tough place to play. And then Tennessee and Knoxville, that's going to be pretty much a tough game. And then same thing with Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium. These are 3 tough road games here for Oklahoma, plus Texas, the neutral site. Yeah, you can tell right away that this is a very tough schedule for Oklahoma. Let's go back to the schedule now and go full game by game now for the Sooners. They'll start things off with a cupcake against Illinois State on August 30th, and then there's that big non-conference game against Michigan at home on September the 6th. Then they go on the road to play Temple. Again, it's it's kind of weird that they're playing Temple on the road here against a group of 5 team. Last year they played them at home. I guess this is just for recruiting. But yeah, they'll play them on September 13th. Then they open up SEC play at home against Auburn on September 20th. And then you get a bye week before playing Kent State. Yeah, that's a weird spot for a bye week. You'd rather have the bye week before playing Texas, obviously, in the big game right there. But yeah, they play Kent State there on October 4th coming out of the bye week. And then they play Texas and Dallas, of course, on October the 11th. It's always a huge game between these two teams, but last year's game obviously was not really that close. Then they play South Carolina on the road on October 18th. And look at this stretch here. They don't play an actual SEC road game until October the 18th. So that's a long time to go without playing an away game in the SEC. So yeah, they're probably not going to be used to the road environment until maybe late season, in the month of November. But yeah, they play South Carolina there on October 18th, and then you got Ole Miss at home on October 25th. Then you go on the road to play Tennessee on November 1st. Then they get a bye week before playing Alabama on the road as well on November 15th. So back-to-back road games there with Tennessee and Alabama. That is brutal, but they get a bye week in between those back-to-back road games, which is really good news. But then you got Missouri the next week on November 22nd. And then you close things out at home with LSU on November 29th. So all in all, this has got to be one of the toughest schedules I have seen so far throughout the SEC teams. I know Florida has a very tough schedule, and then also some other team in the SEC like Vanderbilt. But Oklahoma is right there with them in the top 3 at least in the SEC. And maybe Mississippi State has a tough schedule as well. So that's your schedule. Let's now get a projection here for Oklahoma. This is the scale I'll be using here for their official projection. Basically, if it's a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much going to be counted as an automatic loss. 20% in the orange. That's where Oklahoma will be a double-digit underdog in that percentage. 40% in the yellow, they'll be a clear underdog by 6 or 7 points, so by less than a touchdown. 50-50 games, of course, will stay in the white. Those are really games that can go either way. 60% in the purple, they'll be favored by less than a touchdown, so 6 or 7 points, and then 80% in the blue. They'll be favored by double digits, and then 99% in the green. That's pretty much your guaranteed and also automatic wins here in that percentage. So we'll start with the automatic wins here for Oklahoma. I think you got 3 of those, and those are 3 out of your 4 non-conference teams: Illinois State, Temple, and then Kent State. So these 3 games, I think Oklahoma will be favored in all 3 of them. I know Temple is on the road. That probably should be in the blue, but absolutely no way that Oklahoma is losing this game. They have no business to lose against Temple, especially playing them on the road. So I think all 3 of these non-conference opponents, they are definitely over that 95 to 99% range. Of course, Kent State was one of the worst teams in the country last year, so that's probably going to be the easiest game. And then Illinois State, an FCS team, they should roll over them. And then obviously Temple. Maybe Temple does give them quite some trouble, but it's not really going to be a game that Oklahoma is going to lose, in my opinion. So those 3 games, I think Oklahoma, you can count those as your automatic wins already. And then the rest of the schedule, you can't really favor Oklahoma in, so many of their SEC games, including that Michigan game in the non-conference. So let's go ahead and get into the games where they're going to be underdogs. And most of their games as underdogs are going to be in the yellow. So all these games in the yellow here, as I already got my projection up there at 5 and 7. I'll get to that in just a moment, but Texas, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Alabama, Oklahoma is going to be a clear underdog in all these games. So that's going to give you a total of 5 games where they're going to be clear underdogs. Now, some of them you probably make an argument that they probably should be in the orange. Like, for example, maybe Texas should be in the orange, but because it's on a neutral field, that's the reason why it does bump into the yellow. South Carolina last year, put a whooping on Oklahoma, but I think that's a game that they'll be definitely ready to go. And then Ole Miss, because that game is at home, that's the reason why it does bump into that yellow. Tennessee, because they Tennessee beat Oklahoma last year by 10, but because Oklahoma was right there with them in the fourth quarter, that's the reason why that does drop into the yellow. And then Alabama, that's a game that Oklahoma probably could have a pretty even matchup because they beat them last year, but because Tennessee and Alabama are both on the road, that's the reason why they're both in the yellow. And again, same thing with South Carolina, but Texas, that game is on a neutral field, so maybe it could be a 50-50 game, but Texas is definitely, it seems like they're a more talented team than Oklahoma is. So yeah, all 5 of these games, Oklahoma would be our 6 or 7 point underdog, and we saw that last year. When Oklahoma was an underdog, they lost so many close games by either one possession or maybe by a field goal. Can they win those close games this year in 2025? We'll see, but yeah, that's a pretty brutal, part of the schedule. Again, once they get into SEC play, fully after Kent State, that's where the schedule gets even tougher there, from October the 11th to the end of the season here for Oklahoma. Again, this is why it's such a tough schedule, and that's why you're seeing the projection at 5-7 right now. But yeah, Michigan, Auburn, Missouri, and LSU, I think those are your 50-50 games for Oklahoma. Michigan, because it's at home, that's the reason why it bumps into the 50-50 range. Auburn's kind of a pretty even matchup. Missouri, the reason why that's a 50-50 game is because it's at home for Oklahoma, and same thing with LSU. Now, Missouri and LSU might be more talented teams in Oklahoma, but again, those are 50-50 games because they're all at home here for the Sooners, and that's why the projection is at 5-7. Again, they're going to be mostly underdogs, but I think they split these 50-50 games. They win 2 out of the 4. Let's say they beat Michigan and Auburn, but they lose to Missouri and LSU. That's going to give you a total of 5 wins, including those 3 green games, and then they're mostly going to be underdogs in these yellow games as well. So yeah, 5-7 is what the projected record is for Oklahoma. Again, it's probably one of the toughest schedules in the country, in my opinion. But once the projections and all the schedule breakdowns are completed, we'll be doing top 10 schedules, toughest schedules for all the teams this year in 2025. So yeah, Oklahoma 5-7 is what the projection is. I think best case is making it to a bowl game at least at 6-6, and then worst case at 4-8 or 3-9. If they go 3-9 though or worse, then that's because of how tough the schedule was. But it also will be a disappointing year. But it wouldn't shock me if Oklahoma did go 5-7. Again, this is just a very tough schedule here for Oklahoma in 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree with Oklahoma's projection? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.